Hi everyone, welcome to round 4, final round. My name is Jess, my pronouns are she or they, or matter adjudicator or speaker, studying from opening government. Can you just introduce yourselves, please?
Louis, your bay, please.
Teck's going second, QIUP, thank you.
Razzaq, QIUP, please.
Sarah, Shih, please. Enting, Shih.
Ignacio, Roy here.
Thank you very much. Without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to speak to the motion.
The uncertainty of death systematically prevents people from being able to spend time in the ways that would make them happiest. It makes them afraid, and furthermore, the age at which humans die structurally means that we are unable to make best use of our time on this earth. Finally, we tell you that it makes our resource allocation worse. It means we plunge money into prolonging people's lives. And in a world where we ended life naturally at 50, everybody would be happier, everybody would be healthier, the world would be a better place. Two clear things in this speech. Firstly, happiness. Secondly, health. Before I go into those, two things in the definition. So I want it noted clearly, first of all, that this is a hard cutoff at age 50. And as such, is clearly a process separate from natural human aging, right? Which is a process that's well understood and cannot be something that causes life to end clearly at a particular age. Given that, we think we are perfectly correct in defining this such that this is a human life as it exists at the moment, namely with the health you would expect at age 50, but that life simply ends at that point. We will happily stand behind that. Secondly, I'll just note within the framework of my arguments, this is trivially obvious, but I'll make it clear at the start anyway. Obviously, people will still die young under this motion, right? Not everybody will die at this age. Some people will die in car crashes or from diseases. What we suggest, though, is particularly in the Western world, and moreover in an increasing trend across the globe, a majority of people die over that age, right? They live on into old age and ill health, and this is going to affect the majority of people in how they die. So, firstly, let's talk about happiness. 4 things under why we think this world makes people systematically happier. Number 1, we think they are able to do things when they are younger that make their lives happier, but that would otherwise be deemed too risky because they would cause them to die earlier. So drinking and smoking and eating unhealthily and doing all the things that we talk about as a trade-off between quality of life and quantity of life. On our side of the house, because we're reducing quantity of life for everybody, we are systematically make you able to more enjoy those things that would make your quality of life higher in an early age. We think that makes people happier. That is a good thing for them. Secondly, the time you spend in retirement, right, when you're able to move out of work, which we say could potentially be the happiest time of your life, insofar as at the moment, right, you have to work for a very long time and then enjoy the end of your life. Unfortunately, the physical nature of humanity means that at the moment, that time often ends up being the least enjoyable and systematically suffering. Why is that the case? Firstly, just for physical reasons, right? These are the ages at which your body starts failing you, which you can't stand up, you can't see properly, you can't hear properly, your mind starts to deteriorate. In our world, that is not the case. So in however long it might be, the last 10 or 5 years of your life under this model, when you've made enough money, you can stop working and start retiring, you are able to actually enjoy life. You're able to go out and do sports and like celebrate things with your family and not feel like you are dying physically, right? Secondly, though, and perhaps more importantly, from a mental side of things, often people's retirement becomes an imprisonment of loneliness, where they lose out on their friends, they lose out on contact with their family. We say there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, it's those physical reasons that we told you about just then. But secondly, it's also simply because of a length thing, right? Because you spend so long within the working world, you often lose contact with the friends you made at university who you're often closest to, right? Insofar as we shorten that time, we suggest you're more likely to remain in contact with those people, you're more likely to be useful to your family, not feeling like a burden, but rather somebody who can contribute, who can help raise children, ladies and gentlemen. We give far more meaning to people's lives when, during those last 10 years, they can actually enjoy themselves, they can feel incredibly valued. Thirdly, this allows people to allocate their time correctly and their resources within their lives. So at the point where you know I'm going to die age 50, that is a hard cutoff. That means rather than say, well, I might have time to do this project, I might have time to visit this country when I'm older, you make time for it earlier because you know there is a hard, limited amount of time in that place. But secondly, no thank you. People systematically misallocate their resources because they don't know how long they're going to live. So if I assume I'm going to make it to age 80, but actually I'm unfortunate enough to get cancer age 55, then, and that's like a majority of people, right? Those are the times when you're most likely to get those illnesses and die, right? Then I've just wasted a ton of time hoarding resources that I will never get to use. And we say that's systematically unfair on people, ladies and gentlemen. We say that kills the enjoyment of their life. Fourthly, we suggest this makes people better able to make peace with death, right? And this is an inherent part of the human condition that we suggest obviously will not disappear on our side. People will still be afraid of going into the void. People will still be afraid for their family members. We suggest at the point you make it a clear point, and you say this is the point that you're going to die. You make people, firstly, more able to come to terms with the fact that there's far less randomness involved in the process, right? And that means both that like you're more likely to take time out of your day to say, okay, I need to square myself with this. If I'm afraid, I want to go out with dignity, I want to go out clearly. And that means, for example, the roles of people saying, I am here to make peace with death, like as a medical contribution, for example, in a similar way to we might have palliative care at the end of people's lives at the moment. But secondly, we say it's fairer on friends and family, right? Because you're less likely to say, why was he taken so young? We have fewer people being taken at random times and rather more being taken at a clear point, age 50. We think this makes people happier across the world in a number of ways, and that's a great thing. I'll take a POI for closing if they have one. Opening.
Okay, so at the point where you have less time to accumulate wealth because you just have less time working, and a lot of wealth accumulation happens post-50 when you become truly successful and have a spike in your earnings. Why is it the case that people have more resources to be able to allocate in the good ways they want to
so obviously, firstly, at the point where you're going to live for less long, like everything is going to become truncated, but you need less resources to hoard, right? Because your retirement isn't going to be as long. And also, crucially, because you don't have to hedge against the uncertainty of maybe living to age 80 or 85. Secondly, I suspect resource allocation will become different. The ways jobs pay out to people will become different because they're going to retire sooner. Teck is going to deal with some of that stuff. Secondly, let's talk about health. Two key things here. Firstly, we think an enormous amount of money is pumped into prolonging people's lives. And specifically, this goes towards the wealthiest who get the most ill at the very end of their lives and want to dictate, say, having an extra 2 or 3 or 5 years at the end of their life. That is a gigantic drain on resources. It takes up an enormous amount of medical care, certainly in the Western world. At the point we don't do this, firstly, we just think not having to sink that cost is probably a good thing. And that money, even if it isn't all redistributed in great ways, some of it probably will. But secondly, even insofar as it is used within a medical sector, it is likely to go to things which are more broadly cross-applicable to lots of different people. So as opposed to pumping money into the type of cancer that you get age 70, rather it goes to diseases that are more broadly applicable to people age 30. Now those things are more likely to cross, for example, income boundaries, cross different countries, and likely to be more applicable. We think that is a better allocation of resources. Lastly, we suggest that having more people die in good health age 50 means a drastic uptick in the number of organs that are available to give to people who have organ diseases, right? We think that's like very simple, but also an incredibly valuable thing that will mean lots of people who would otherwise die young will not have to do so, will be able to live free, happy lives. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a great idea. We prefer this world. We're proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the opposition leader to open the opposition's case.
This is annoying. A life worth living isn't one that you do not know, rather one that you can maximize to your fullest extent. That is to say that sometimes what you do in life is not a priori more important than the amount of things you can do in life, given that you have a longer period of time. There are two ineluctable realities in Prop's case. The first is people definitely live longer than in their world, because by virtue of the definition, that is the case, and therefore more time to do whatever they want to do. But secondly, more importantly, there's a set framework by which individuals should live. That is to say, given certainty, there's a process by which you should go through, a time frame by which you should achieve certain things, and that is expected of individuals because they die exactly at 50. And that is the framework opening opposition morally opposes. The speech will divide two things. We'll deal first with uncertainty or certainty, which one's better. Second, we'll talk about duration, why the prospects of a life greater than 50 and even extending towards 120 is good. Let's first talk about uncertainty. I think it's important to note that their arguments are actually very much problematic, because Lewis first claimed to uncertainty such that you can't live a happy life if you don't know when you're going to die. Maybe, but no one expects to die before 60. That is to say, the uncertainty that plagues your life is not something that happens between when you are 0 to 50. So within the time frame they will talk about, no one really expects to die. So that harm is at best a wash. But what is the case though, is that people should be given the choice to prioritize short-term life gains over other things. What does this mean? So their characterization is one that people be able to enjoy smoking or alcohol because it means that they don't have to trade it off with a life that's worse later on post-50. Maybe. But I think in our world, that's already perfectly possible. If you feel that you can die earlier as a result of cancer, then you smoke anyway, and you don't care about that, you make that choice. However, the option of the converse doesn't exist in their world because you die at 50. So you're expected to destroy your body to an extent that you die at 50. You're expected to consume that. And individuals who otherwise would prefer a life beyond 50 can't necessarily access that. And that means, on the comparison, the weight goes on us. But what else? Given those benefits, we think certainty gives you even worse harms on the psychological the psychological effects on a human being. There is more pressure on success. No, his argumentation is one that you can focus on taking risks, focus on doing other things in life, given that there's a set time frame to your life. However, that's contingent on your ability to do so, your ability to succeed at stuff like this. Not everyone is able to get into Oxford at 18 years old. Not everyone is able to get a good job in financial services upon graduation. And what that means is that with an age, which a time frame of 50, you expect certain things to be done at one point, and if you fail to do so, you are considered less worth, or rather, you consider yourself a failure to the point at which you're not at pace with the average human being. And that's in fact a problem, right? Because in our world, the expectation of a longer life means that it's okay to sacrifice certain points of your life, and therefore it means that's better. But what's the comparison then? That means in their world, there's a significant proportion of human beings who live a life of regret because they're unable to keep up pace with the average human expectancy that gets certain jobs in certain parts of their life, i.e. milestones. However, in our world, the worst that can happen is someone dying in regret because they didn't get to do something because life or death is uncertain. That doesn't really matter. If the death can't get harmed, so at any point that you regret at death is not really a problem in our world. Next, let's talk about duration. Why is that better? No, thank you. I think this broadly divides into two things, the individual as well as, say, the social benefits we want to talk about. With regards to the individual, enjoyment isn't just about how much time you have and how you allocate it. It's also about having the opportunity to actually do something. And this is where OG's characterization naturally fails. People in the world aren't always able to do everything that they want. They need money, they need networks, they need other relationships to be engaged upon. All these things take time. This is about developing, say, meaningful connections with other individuals, getting enough wealth to go skydiving. All those things aren't something every individual can do. In their world, that means a significant proportion of individuals would live and die having not been able to do the things they like because they're unable to live beyond that time frame of life in order to necessarily access the things they want to enjoy. But furthermore, we would say the enjoyment of life is not something that's is not a diminishing returns. That is to say, even at old age, you may face physical harms, but you derive other benefits that make life more meaningful to you. That is the shift in prospects on how you view life. So at young age, you prefer things like more risk taking, going all out, and then in old age, you put value in things like familial connections or establishing a legacy. And all those things are different things which you access with the existence of a long life, but not something that can happen in their world because people die exactly at 50. Before that, yeah.
So why should that be, in your best case, right? That might be true for some people and they have a pleasant life of the mind in older age. Why do we care more about that than those who have terrible old ages filled with loneliness and pain? I think there are two reasons to that. First is the reason that majority of individuals can't access the good life you don't talk about within 50 years. That's one. But secondly, like the thing is, the problem with people dying of old age and loneliness is a problem that is significantly less of a problem now than it was in the past. Why is that the case? Because the problems they want to talk about of like illness and loneliness in old age is a dynamic problem. Dynamic in a way that it diminishes. Because as people spend more and more time in investing, in pensions, in economic growth, wealth accumulation, what that necessarily means is that you're able to make life post 50 more and more accessible and more
livable because people just are able to access better technology. And in that way, the converse is that within 50, you still face the same sort of problems where you're unable to necessarily access the things you do given wealth constraints. But it goes beyond that. For the society, their main point was that a lot of wealth is spent on individuals going to old age. So this is one to do with like health, as well as one to do with like pensions. The thing is, with regards to health, we don't see any harm in people spending a lot of money on extending their life, because anyway, if that wasn't the case, they would end up spending it on other things. So like any sort of spending necessarily helps the economy. So any form of redistribution that doesn't really make a difference in their world. But specifically to wealth accumulation, we would contend that actually the ability for people to hoard resources isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just because they live to an old age, many people become philanthropists because they have just too much money and they end up donating anyway. But for other individuals, when they die unexpectedly at 65, having accumulated a lot of money, those things get redistributed either via their children who spend the money anyway, or via the estate tax, where individuals get to access the resources through the death tax. So in all those instances, actually, there is no a priori harm to individuals accumulating wealth. They have to tell us why. The alternative is that wealth then goes to other individuals on the ground, because that doesn't necessarily happen. People just spend. So at the end of the day, either that money is spent via investments in pension funds, or they're spent on like lavish lifestyles because you're going to die at 50. No comparison whatsoever. In this debate, we have to understand that life within 50 years is going to be set in stone. But the unknown is what makes it attractive, because you live a life that can be fulfilling or might not, but you won't regret it because you're dead. Thank you.
I thank you for the speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue.
Kind of small. We good? Three things: refutation, new material, bring back some of the things Louis says. Opening up says that on our side of the house, we set a framework and a time frame that is built in expectations for what you should do. This is a bad thing. I'm not sure why it's a bad thing, but more importantly, I'm not sure why it goes away. The thing about expectations is that people are the ones doing the expecting. And presumably in every society, there's going to be some expectation of when you should do things in your life. We shift that, admittedly, and we're okay with that. We just don't see why this is a terrible thing or why it gets any more arbitrary on our side of the house. Next thing they say, enjoyment requires money and networks. You need time to build this up. You need that amount of time right now because people at the top accumulate that wealth and hold on to positions like being at a CEO level or a managerial position that they do not give up until they choose to retire. And as Louis told you, they tend to retire at a very late age because they're not sure when they want to stop accumulating wealth because of the uncertainty that goes on. There is less time that is required on our side of the house to accumulate this wealth because there's a heck lot more certainty about when you need to stop accumulating wealth and move on with enjoying things in life. Those networks cycle through way more quickly on our side of the house, and everyone has broadly an equal amount of time required to obtain those things. To the extent that there's this uncertainty there, we improve that. But here's a final bit of rebuttal that flips this argument. On our side of the house, it is easier to create things like old age pensions that give money to people because we know how long we're going to have to pay this out for. One of the biggest problems right now with giving things like Social Security to help old people live in their old age and make them not feel like shit about themselves is simply we don't want to take on the tax burden not knowing how much it's going to commit us to 20 years in the future. At the point where we do know that, you are certain that the amount of money you need to do like skydiving or to read a novel, to write a novel, whatever that may be, you're more likely to get that money in the political system on our side of the house. We give people more certainty, and as a result, we give them more time to do what they want with those resources. The last thing they say is there's more time to pursue the good life. The reason they gave is because you're alive for a longer period of time. I'm going to grant that this is like an intuitive prima facie claim, but there are a few problems with this. The first is a lot of this time is not spent healthy. As Louis tells you, there's no point being alive if you're bedridden. As a result, you're sort of obstructed from doing the very things you care about. Ergo, no thank you, it doesn't give you the sort of meaning that they care about. Second of all, the uncertainty means over-saving and overworking in the prime years of your life, instead of using that time to do the very things they care about. That's why so many people live and die in regret. That's why at their deathbeds they say, I wish I'd done this at a younger age, because right now I didn't realize what life would be like, and as a result, I didn't realize that these opportunities would be taken away from me. If you know what life would be like at age 60, i.e. you're dead, you're more likely to have information that says at age 45, nearing the end of my career, I will stop this job and I will do something that truly matters. Last of all, ageist norms, and this is again, new bit of rebuttal, ageist norms often kick in, no thank you, when you are seen as potentially frail or weak. That is to say, your children start saying, this isn't good for you, and as a result, you shouldn't do things like this. You should stay with me rather than live alone and independently. So our society that we live in tends to, no thank you, as a result of ailment, tell old people that they should live within the confines of a home that is either a caretaker or that the children provides for them. No, thank you. For all these reasons, simply living longer does not mean you have more things and more time to do the things you care about. On outside of the house, you give people those resources and you give people the state of mind to activate those desires. We win this point. No, thank you. 2 bits of new material. The first, sustainable living on outside of the house. I think it's unintuitive that the environmental burden we are currently placing is unsustainable. We think population control is good for the environment and scarce amount of resources we currently have. We think this burden can be reduced in 2 ways. One way, which we support, is for lots of individual people to live shorter amounts of time. That's what we propose. And we think that's just going to happen by fiat. Ergo, you're not going to live to your 50s, 60s, and 70s, and as a result, consume things and buy cars that pollute the environment. Like the chain of logic there can be illustrated in many ways, but I think it's very intuitive. Now, the part we have to prove is that people won't compensate for this, no thank you, by having more children, because presumably that redresses the effects one way or the other. And the argument here is simple, because the choices that parents make to have children are in no way influenced by what that child's life will be like past age 50. In the worst cases, they might care about fewer children, giving them resources to take care of them at old age. But presumably when they're age 50, they still won't need 10 kids to get them that resources. No, thank you, because there's an uncertainty of how long they're going to live. If they make decisions about having children out of things like love and affection, you don't change those decisions simply because you now live or die at age 50. You are still likely to outlive your kids. So nothing about the decision to have children is affected by this policy, or this world, I suppose. But then outside of the house, people live for shorter periods of time. The world is more sustainable. Second bit of new material. No, thank you. You get quicker social change. 2 claims. One, the arc of history bends naturally towards morality. People make this claim all the time, but here's the reason why. The reason why is because people become more informed and they give things like rights to individuals who then speak up and say, actually, if you care about this value in life, why are we denying this value to some other group? And over time, people begin to realize that a lot of the barriers that human beings construct between us aren't actually legitimate and are often invalidated. And that's why over time, you get more and more moral things. What stops this moral arc from bending quicker? Unfortunate, but probably old people. The reason for this is quite simple. 3 things. Number 1, they tend to be politically active at the point of their retirement. They're the ones who are free, they do campaigning and stuff. They're a very important swing bloc and vote in most Western liberal democracies. So annoyingly, people listen to them. See Brexit. Number 2, they tend to be a relatively large population segment in the developed world for the simple reason that, that's where increasingly as countries get richer and richer, no thank you, population pyramids begin to shrink, you have fewer and fewer children. And so old people tend to then be a very fat bit of the pyramid at the very top. Last of all, they're quite obstinate. They care about things like nostalgia and they want things to go back to the way they were. As a result, it's often very hard to create democratic political change up to the point where they are unfortunately removed from the equation. I'll take you in just a second. On our side of the house, they still exist, but the cycling is much faster. Society moves through stages of development morally and ethically a lot more quicker, which means that people are denied their rights for shorter periods of time. This applies to literally any minority you can think of. It's about feminism, it's about race, it's about wealth. You can fit any of these groups in. We've given you the key reason why this happens. Opening.
Your form of illness, or even the bad opinions, the so-called bad opinions of old people, are some things which are dynamic. That is to say, they diminish over time as generations change. Is there one certain harm they can give as a result of this?
Yes, Razzaq. They diminish quicker on our side of the house because they don't vote from the period in which they're 50 to the point where they are 80 for all the reasons I've given you. The change happens a lot faster. We win that point. Responses to defenses and things that Louis tells you. I mean, there's disappointingly little actual argumentative response from Razzaq other than sort of a hand waving that says, they will now expect this at age 50. Just a few things I want to know. The only thing they responded to in the point about happiness was to say, risky things and your decision to smoke don't change because you still be willing to die at 50, something of the sort. Here's the logic in an intuitive way. If you don't have to bear the pain of a cancer metastasizing at the age of 65, you're more likely to say, I'm going to do this thing now. And the reason you have to bear that pain is because, as we told you, that harm comes about at a later stage of a cell's development. If at the point at which your cells are naturally going to end at a certain point, that's something you can change about the way you make a decision. Most of all, people might not expect to die immediately, but that doesn't mean it's a wash, because on our side of the house, they don't have to have as much certainty over things like retirement, their health, their body, or their cost of living. The last thing they say is, there's better technology, something. We don't see why they'll spend money anyway on other types of medical treatment, so the economy is fine. Our claim was never about the economy. Our claim was that it just seems to us immoral that white rich assholes have all the money to pay to prolong their life by 5 years when that wealth and the votes for where that money would go would otherwise go to things which would be useful and valuable for everyone who lives to age 50, which is a far larger block of the comparative than anything on their side of the house. Propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue the
I think the problem coming out from opening government is that they assume that there is one good life. They assume that because we know what kind of good life we want to have, therefore the certainty of when we die allows us to allocate resources now for the next like 30 years until we die, and that will give some degree of certainty because we know what we want. I don't think people know what we want, and I think it takes time for people to find out what they want. So giving people more time gives them more ability to find out what they want, but also B, a better quality of decision when they can recalibrate their decisions all the time to figure out what they want because there is no certainty of death. And at that point, when you find that you have a life in front of you that leads on to like, you can't see the end of it, you're more willing to like change your life path and go towards the things that you want because you have like bigger benefits, as opposed to if you figure it out magically at age 45, you're like, oh shit, I got 5 years left. Maybe I should just stick to this path of success that society has dictated for me. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. I'm going to firstly tell you why people's rationality and incentives change and how that happens. And then secondly, we'll talk about a little bit about societal expectations and pressures, integrating a lot of reconstruction into that, because I think we have quite a consistent case line that wasn't just never really dealt with on their side about why society dictates to you what you want and why you have less ability to resist that conformity in their world. Before that, refutation. So let's deal with this weird social change argument that like Teck did, right? So he tells you that like, because we have like generations moving across faster, therefore you have like better degrees of faster degrees of social change. Look, like I think social change happens when people form meaningful connections with other people around them, right? Where you create conceptions of rights and conceptions of morality that comes across through time because you have a greater degree of philosophizing and like thinking about life and things like that. Note that like lots of philosophers are old white men. Yes, they are white men, but they're also old. That's kind of important. It's because like they literally have more life experience to think about these things, and they literally have more time to think beyond themselves, because we argue that people who are younger are more self-interested. If you have less time to live, limited amounts of capital because you can't work as hard, or they don't want them to work as hard, no thanks, and also just generally less life experience to expose you to many different people from many different parts of the world, you do tend to be more self-interested and less willing to help people who are different from you, right? That's a comparison to people who have lived longer, who are more educated about the world, who have seen more of the world, or who have like, for example, have enough wealth that they feel happy and satisfied with themselves, that you meet your basic necessities, and therefore like are willing to go to higher order preferences and higher order needs of actually thinking about what is best ways to structure society and things. So we argue that like, I think that we kind of take it, but even if you don't buy that, it's probably a wash insofar as like social change like will still happen on both sides because of people like liberalizing anyway. So I don't think that's important. The second constructive material gave us about environment. I think that this is less important. I'll deal with it a little bit more about societal expectations and pressure. About incentives. But I just think that like if you live for less time, you care less about the environment in which you live, i.e. like the earth around you, especially when you are not there to face the pressures of climate change. It's really hard enough for us to care about the earth on which our children are going to live on, no thanks. Like, never mind that they are our children, we should care about them. How the hell am I going to have to care about my grandchildren or people beyond that? Like, I just don't understand why this environmental climate change argument works. Okay, let's talk about rationality and incentives. Look, I think like the main characterization coming out from us is that people are still self-interested and greedy, and therefore they still continue to overwork themselves. They still continue to accumulate wealth and hoard their wealth, and they do so in ways that are harmful on their side of the house. Why is this the case? The reasons why the characterization for opening government happens, i.e. people are overworked, i.e. people accumulate wealth and everything, is because people are self-interested, right? And we argue that the self-interest of when you're happy with your wealth, no thanks, comes about not due to like your surroundings, but due to the objective measure of what is like a comfortable life. It's literally material comfort, right? So I want to have a big house, I want to have a pool, I want to have all the money that I don't have to think about, and I probably still want more than that because I probably want investment funds and shares as well. Those things don't change. The only thing that changes is the amount of time you have to get there, which means less people are likely to get there for three reasons. The first reason is that you just have less time to be able to do work, and therefore like you don't like accumulate as much wealth. The second reason is that investments and other things just take less time. You have less time for them to pay off, and therefore you're less likely to want to rely on those things. You want to probably work even more, so therefore the stuff are overworking just ends up being flipped on them. But thirdly, because we argue that like on their side of the house, we argue that like people, yeah, sure, go ahead.
We win the environment point anyway, because even if people care more of the environment on the outside of the house, they don't care enough to consume literally zero for 20 to 30 years. We say.
What? No, I think it's just a wash, right? Like, they're going to consume zero things on our side. But like, insofar as you have like equal amounts of people, okay, also what you're trying to get is that you're going to get less people. Okay, like that's just like not the point, right? We argue that like if you have more resources to be able to like produce things in society because you have more people who are working, you probably can create like renewable energy faster because you have more degrees of innovation and more degrees of productivity. Okay, done. Okay, let's actually go back to the important stuff about incentives. So like arguably people are more willing to like, once they reach that point in time, go on to other things like philanthropy, right? I look at Bill Gates, he accumulates a huge amount of wealth, and after he was able to meet his base needs, that's when he's willing to give money to charity. On their side, they have never dealt with their argument that you just have more charity and more philanthropy. Even if you don't buy that, let's talk about risky behavior and how the rationality changes, right? We argue that on their side, they incentivize risky behavior that is bad for 3 reasons. One, because this is bad because one, it's more unpredictable, right? So risky behavior mitigates the stuff that they said about certainty, because if you are engaging in more risky behaviors, you have more likely to get cancer at younger ages, therefore diminishing the amount of certainty they have. But also it diminishes their good of being able to deal with, like, being able to plan for your death. No thanks, because now you're exposed to these ills at a younger age. But secondly, we argue that this incentivizes, like, risky behavior disincentivizes people to have like social support structures, right? Because fundamentally, if you're self-interested but you are gaming on the like big gains that you get by having risky behaviors because you want to accumulate wealth faster in quicker amount of time because you don't have that much time, we argue that people are less willing to spend money on things like the pension system, on social support systems, because there's less likelihood that they're able to go into those, or they think that they're less likely to go into those instances because you're less likely to reach that old age where you rely on their pension and social support structures. Importantly, social support structures help everybody, not just the old. It helps you when you fall into times of need. It helps you when you meet unexpected circumstances. That's something that people discount anyway because they don't think they're going to reach to that instance, right? But they do know that they're going to reach to old age on our side of the house, and they're more likely to therefore plan for that. At the end of the day, how does this affect societal expectations and pressures? We argue that it's about how you live your life. And if you're going to live a correct life on their side of the house, because you have less time to fight against societal pressures, you have less time to deviate from that, you have less time to form meaningful identities because you have less life experiences to figure out what you want. That results in less meaningful life and a lower quality of life for people. For those reasons, I'm so proud to oppose.
I think the speech of the Iraqi government members and the government.
Opening opposition's case rests on 2 premises. The first is this idea that the more you live, the more time you have to do things, and those things that you are going to do with your increased amount of time are probably going to be good things. The second thing they tell you is that the longer you live, because old people are magically less selfish than young people, life is going to get better for everyone around you. Both of those 2 things are probably demonstrably false. I'm going to go through those in a bit. Before I start, I just want to give a quick point of rebuttal on this idea about selfishness and why young people aren't necessarily more selfish than old people. First of all, I think when you are uncertain when you are going to die, you are probably more likely than not to err on the side of caution, because presumably you are more likely to want to preserve your own standard of living as long as possible. Recognize that money actually becomes increasingly important as one grows older, as opposed to when one is a young individual, because of the changing and increasing needs of elderly individuals due to the accumulation and snowballing of conditions in your body, a diminished immune system, your lack of ability to continue to engage with life around you in the same capacities as you have known prior, your need to maintain this kind of standard of living forces you to spend ever-increasing amounts of money. As a result, you are far more likely to hoard when you are young as opposed to later. Second of all, I think the reduction of capacities when you are old actually means you are far more likely to be selfish, because at the point where you don't know how long more you're going to live, you want to maintain at least a comparable standard of living, because your glory days will always be remembered in your mind as the time when I had it all, as opposed to being confronted with the constant reality of your aging and feeble body, where the only way you can compensate for it is the amount of money you have. On the comparative on our side, what we give you is a scenario where individuals know when they're going to end, and as a result, don't have their impressions of their youth clouded by the years spent between their youth and their death. They don't look back at this constant romantic fantasy about how much better life was when I was young, when things were more conservative, or when things were better for me. As a result, you're far less likely to be selfish in the same way that opening opposition wants you to think. 2 points of extension for you today. First of all, on uncertainty and what it does to your psychological process, why instinctively many of us shun and shirk away from analyzing the void into which our death is. And second of all, talking about generational uncertainty and why this creates a miasma of like sadness and depression for millennials. Okay, first of all, let's talk about uncertainty and what this does to your psychological things. I think, first of all, when you are confronted with the prospect of something unexpected happening, you are far more likely to be more anxious about it than if you had something that was certain coming to you. This is why when you have aging parents or friends who are ill, but you don't have a set timeline for when they are going to leave you, you fear and you live in that state of fear, and you don't actually know what is going to become of you after this. This necessarily limits your ability to plan and prepare yourself for many important changes that might come in your life. And we think this state of uncertainty is just the bad one to live in. But second of all, it removes the fuzziness of not knowing when we leave and forces us to think concretely about the end of our lives in a way that we are never forced to right now. Why is this the case? Because as we all know, being in college, deadlines actually force us to confront the deadlines and act in a way that allows us to have tangible outcomes to show for it. It forces us to sit down and think whether our continued consumption is worth our contributions to the community. We will ponder what we want to leave our children, our grandchildren, our communities, our families. Why does this not happen when you don't know where you're going to end? Because there is a deep fear of engaging with the prospect that one day your life will be nothing. And that fear becomes even deeper when you don't know when the end of your life is going to happen. Because you don't know when it is going to happen, you can live comfortably in the belief that you can keep postponing it as long as you don't have to think too hard about it. I think that if you set a concrete deadline to the end, you prevent people from being able to remain comfortably agnostic about what they choose to leave as their legacy. Back half.
Your opening government already said that you can die prior to 50 years old, which means that the uncertainty of death might still exist on your side and it still doesn't change.
Yes, there is this thing where you have like big uncertainty and like small uncertainty, right? Like presumably you remove at least some amount of uncertainty when you know you have a fixed deadline. Just because you can die earlier doesn't necessarily mean there's more uncertainty on our side. I think that's kind of strange. No, thank you. Second of all, I want to talk about how people relate to you and your legacy, your perceptions of others, etc. I think being old actually transforms how people engage with you and relate with you in a sense, right? Because not only does your own capacity diminish, not only do your desires, your ability to fulfill things you want to fulfill diminish, people no longer remember you as being vibrant and engaged with the rest of society, but instead start seeing you as someone rather pathetic, feeble, who does not necessarily need to be remembered. This causes additional amounts of selfishness and fear about your own position in life as you near the end of it. And it's a situation many of us probably don't want to think about as we constantly consider ourselves in the prime of our youth. When you set a fixed cutoff for the end of your life, you force people to again consider how people will remember them in the middle ages, as opposed to as frail unknown beings, and therefore I think you actually get reduced selfishness on our side. Second of all, I want to talk to you about different generations and how this increases opportunities for individuals. I think right now the generations actually kind of live in a miasma of existential angst, right? Because you don't have an ability to access opportunities in a way that maximizes your own happiness. Primarily, this is because people tend to cling on to their jobs and their current ways of life for as long as possible for all the reasons that I've already just given you. What then does this mean? It means that the accumulation of life experience and lifespan and wealth makes older generations increasingly difficult to compete with. This creates a societal shift in the kinds of milestones that we are expected or indeed anticipated to achieve at every single point in life. There's a reason why the ages of first job, first career, moving out, being financially independent have moved steadily backwards and further away as the years have gone on. This is precisely because of the kinds of extended lifespans we have. On the comparative, what we have is a shortening of lifespans at a certain point. This increases egalitarianism for two reasons. Just first of all, you have less wealth to pass on. But second of all, because you have less need to accumulate wealth to pass on to individuals, and you are more likely to think about about what you want to pass on and how you want to be remembered, you are far more likely to vacate your jobs at a reasonable time or be forced to vacate them, thus allowing younger generations the ability to be more upwardly mobile. At the end of the day, what happens to younger generations on the opposition side? They are stuck in a situation where, due to constant medical advancements, they are suddenly locked out of the ability to then enjoy those medical advancements. There's a reason there's a shrinking middle class. There's a reason why younger generations are constantly unable to be more upwardly mobile. And that particular reason is because old individuals tend to be almost impossible to compete with. If we remove this and we force people to confront the end of their lives, they are far more likely to act in ways that they want to be remembered, far less likely to hold on to positions as long as possible, and far more likely to create a society all of us would prefer to live in.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the opposition member to extend the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, the extension that you'll get from Ateneo A will not be contingent on whether or not, as people go old, they'll be nicer. We say, even if old people are more self-interested, we create a more productive world, the point at which you're able to reach the benefits of people beyond 60. We think, coming from government side, it was an assertion for them to say the point at which you turn 50, your productivity goes down. We think that's offensive and outdated. I'll prove to you my extension as to why actually, if you go beyond 50, that's when you increase productivity. But secondly, we would weigh in the opening debate about whether or not we're able to maximize life, and we'll tell you, even if you want to be able to maximize your life, you're not able to do so, the point in which your life is restricted to page 50. But before that, a few responses. First, on this claim that uncertainty leads to greater anxiety. I already initially responded to it in a POI, that it doesn't eradicate uncertainty from their side of the house, because you also are unsure what time you're gonna die, because it is also possible for you to die before the age of 50. So we don't think that the benefit that they gain from removing anxiety is that great. But secondly, it is a huge assertion to claim that just because you have uncertainty, you get more anxiety. For a large part of this world, people would rather have the hope of being able to challenge your death versus their ability, for instance, to accept death as a matter of fact. A lot of people would prefer having chance in debate tournament, even if it's small, versus not having a chance at all. At best, that's a wash, and you can't claim it's an exclusive benefit for their side of the house. So dealing with anxiety is not an issue in today's debate, because it can apply to both sides. So first, on this very ability for us to create a more productive world, my response to competing between generations will be integrated. The assumption of government side, particularly open in government, is that the older you get, the less productive you become. Maybe this was true in the 1900s when physical labor was the primary driver of economies. But as time progressed, your physical labor is no longer as important as your mental labor and intellectual ability. Why is this true? With the development of things like computers, the development of things like automation, your ability to carry heavy loads or to be able to bring different things or like manufacture is not as important as your ability to have your brain develop and create new ideas within the world. Why is this important then? When you pass the life of 50, we recognize that your physical body diminishes, but your mental ability usually increases as well. There's an inverse relationship for that. One, because you have more time to get education, more time to go to school, more time to accumulate knowledge from the world. But secondly, the more time you work, no thank you, that's when you're able to get even more life skills to develop your own talents. But lastly, as they said in closing government, you have more lived experiences, which means that generally you're able to understand how the world works. The nature of knowledge is that it is cumulative and you accumulate it over time. That's why on their side, they diminish a huge chunk of the population who has access to that knowledge. No, thank you. So what, right? It means that most of the scientists that we have are go beyond 50, right? All the professors that you know that are really, really good are past that age, and you take them away under your side of the house because they die before the age ends. But secondly, even from a more grassroots level, a lot of the community leaders who are important in guiding order in small communities are also the older ones because they have the lived experience, understand how order necessarily works. Why is this argument important? because it's not contingent on them being nice, as opening opposition wants to claim. Even if they're selfish, the point in which if you're a scientist, you become more productive as you go older, or because you're an educator or professor, you also become more productive as you go older because you experience or get that life experience. So we create more innovation under our side of the house, and we're able to develop things like the sciences and all that. That means our society becomes more productive. No, thank you. Why is this important? In opening's case and closing government, their claim is that we're able to allocate resources better, the point in which we are able to remove old people because now they're less of a burden in society. That argument falls right now because we have proven to you why older generations are actually productive members en masse to the society and give things they're not able to get in younger generations. That means under their side, they're the ones reducing the number of resources in society because you remove that knowledge pool that is more important in the 21st century as compared to the physical labor that you get from the younger generations. So if your argument is you want a productive society where everyone's get better off with more resources, we get that under our side. Before I move on, opening. Oh, okay. So next, where are we able to maximize the lifespans of individuals? Because what opening government claim is that we want the certainty of both. Sorry, wait. Before that, I want to respond to the closing government's case where they said we want to create this entire idea. The problem is to compete between generations. First, that's a concession. At the older generations are far more productive. That's why it's harder to compete with them. But secondly, we disagree that the competition exists because, as I flagged earlier, your skill sets are different. For younger generations who have a greater capacity to do physical labor and physical work, that's why they're able to do other jobs that don't require, that are not as mentally intensive, but require more physical labor. That's why they start with being an assistant or a secretary and all these other jobs that require a bigger or stronger mental body ability. So we don't think that the competition necessarily exists. But lastly, we would say that that competition, assuming it does exist, will also exist in your side of the house, because while older people have a shorter time, younger people also have a shorter time to compete with them. So we think at best it's a wash again. Before I move on, sure. Literally, the number of people who are scientists, doctors, or CEOs is far smaller than the vast majority of elderly people who are forced to work in things like cleaners and they work far longer hours when they don't have that certainty. It's just another game. I'm not sure your case is as big of an impact as you think. First and foremost, we would suggest that as time progresses, even the lower middle class jobs become even clearly more automated. Like if you were a secretary before, you need a mental ability to write a lot of things. Now you can use a computer. So it's not an upper class mentality. It transcends over time. But secondly, as I already said, right, a lot of small communities require knowledge bases like leaders, for instance, who guide the community. You don't get that under your side of the house. But secondly, who is able to maximize your lifespan? Because opening government says, and closing government, that the certainty of death means that you're able to maximize the life that you want to live. All responded to this rightly by saying, no matter how much you want to live your life, but you won't be able to do so anyway. But what they weren't able to do in this debate was respond to the government's response again, when they said, but you can restructure how retirement works so that in the last 10 or 5 years, you'll be able to retire anyway, and there's no more harm, and you can maximize your life if you're poor. Why is it impossible for you to be able to restructure retirement age? And this is why we have to go do a bit of numbers, right? One, if you have children, the point in which, and usually people have children from 25 to 30, that means the only time they become independent from you is when you already turn 50, right? So a huge chunk of your life has to be contributing to your children, which means it's very hard for you to be financially independent and not need the resources. But secondly, systems like education, systems like work environments require a certain period of time before you're able to develop. We think it's structurally impossible for you to just remove 10 years of your life and make it so that you retire in the age 40, because the ability for you to accumulate wealth is impossible. Their stance on maximizing life was a privileged stance that you can enjoy your good life now. What we suggest is that it's a luxury to be able to enjoy your life beyond 50, and that's why we want to propose, and we're very proud to take this debate. Thanks.
I think the speaker for their speech and invite the government whip to the government portion of the debate.
all of us at some point grapple with the question of what does it all mean? What is the meaning of life? But the truth is, most of us never get to the point where we can actually reckon with the question. And that is because our lives are dominated both individually and socially by the fear of the unknown, the fear of the great void, the fear of death. Note that there is a qualitative difference between the normal uncertainty that comes from not knowing about whether you will be hit by a car tomorrow while crossing the road, touch wood, or the normal uncertainty that comes when you don't know whether you will win a debate or lose a debate. The point here is control over those odds. You can think about it. Am I likely to, more or less likely to die if I do this activity or that activity or so on and so forth? But the mortality that comes unbeknownst to us, that you cannot think about when it creeps up on you, is the mortality of old age in today's world, in the status quo. Right? You can't know when you will die. As much as doctors try to give you some control over it, saying if you eat right, if you do this and you do that when you're young age, you're less likely to die this time. You just don't know when you will go. Much of life is spent battling against that on an individual level, focusing on yourself, thinking about how you can control that destiny. We think that is central to the human experience. Knowing that you will die at 50 removes all of that uncertainty, allows you to focus your mind on far more important things, on other things, like figuring out what you actually want in life, and so on and so forth. I want to deal with a few things in my speech. The first thing is I want to deal with this idea that more life gives more choice, gives a better ability to appreciate what you have. I want to deal with, secondly, the idea that a longer life is a life with which you can accrue more experience and have more productivity and why that's better. And finally, I want to deal centrally with selfishness. Because I think one thing in this debate is that we have to recognize there is a trade-off between people living for longer periods of time and the fact that the counterfactual is just that if everyone is essentially selfish or self-interested to some degree, as long as people live for longer periods of time, their interests will essentially be rival to other people who are younger than them, other people around them. We think one way of resolving their selfishness is firstly to make them less self-oriented in the first place, but secondly, simply to have them not exist. So the first question, is it true that just more life is more time and more choice? Note that the logical corollary of this argument from opening opposition is that we can somehow evaluate the subjective happiness of each individual and say that they are more likely to be able to make better decisions about their life if they have more time to think about this, as if the answer to the meaning of life were linearly correlated with how much time you have to think about that. That is firstly face value likely to be untrue, because these existential questions likely don't correlate with how much time you can spend thinking about them, but more likely correlate with whether your thinking about them is dominated primarily with addressing the fear of death and how to control the state and direction of your own mortality, vs being able to think about what is good for you within your limited time of existence, where you know that you'll die at age 50. So that's first. Secondly, we think it's just true that people reframe their subjective happiness based on the general conditions of the world, right? So in a world where everyone died at 50, people presumably will reframe their happiness differently. So I think most of opening opposition's world is just kind of irrelevant because it bases itself on subjective happiness. But second, let's deal with this idea of productivity and authority coming up from closing opposition. So the idea here is that age is aligned with productivity because you're able to accrue knowledge and experience through time. I think this is firstly false, because the examples they use, things like, for example, doctors and professors are old and we respect them, is a fact of life because these people happen to exist. And if you think about it, in a world where life expectancy used to be relatively short, the initial reason why we give authority to old people in the first place is because they've, in our eyes, been able to cheat death in some way, right? Because their very existence at age 60 and the appearance of health and so on and so forth suggests to us that they've cracked the code of the problem of death. So that is the initial reason why these people gain authority in the first place. But secondly, just neurologically speaking, right? These claims about accruing experience don't hold up, because firstly, it's just true that our brains cannot contain all the knowledge that our life experiences give to us. That's why we do things like read books and put things in archives and so on and so forth. But secondly, it is just true that these things are also offset by medical conditions that come with the onset of old age, things like dementia and so on and so forth. So your neurological neuron connections sort of break down and so on and so forth. I think it is false that these people are more experienced or better able to make decisions. And lastly, because it is not true that your lived experiences or the accrual of these experiences makes you better able to judge things. Instead, what I think is true is that it makes you more likely to be locked into your modes of thought. This is more and more true. Know that this is more and more true in situations where society, either because of technological reasons or cultural reasons, is progressing faster. That is to say, the greater the percentage of all people who exist and are in positions of power, as closing opposition would like to prefer, the less you have an ability to have the power brokers and decision makers in your society keep up with the pace of technological, cultural, or paradigmatic change, because their beliefs are locked in the knowledge that they have accrued that makes them worse at making decisions. Yes.
People have limited mental capacities. You don't prove why people have enough capacity to deal with existential threats, rather than be completely crippled when it's concentrated on people aged 45 to 50. The trade-off is they can forget about the certainty of death and instead focus on creating the most meaningful lives for themselves by using their mental capacity to think about what they want to have.
No, I don't think you carry through that same degree of existential threat when you know for sure that your life will end to a specific date. We can literally calculate down to the later, like possibly just the next hour when you will pass, as opposed to literally not knowing when your life will be snatched away from you. Often, people, for example, who have been told by doctors that they have X number of days left to live lives with a new sense of clarity because they know now what they have left versus what they don't. We think also in these instances, the fear of death makes you far more selfish. It's the third thing I want to talk about in my speech. Firstly, the fact that you have more time to think about your selfishness and are uncertain about that means that you constantly are focused on thoughts of your own infirmity. You're far more likely to turn inwards and focus on how you can try to control that or try to hedge against that by accruing wealth and so on and so forth. But secondly, as Enting tells you, importantly, you're far more able to accrue wealth through a longer period of life through a longer period of living on Earth, and it is far more unfair for the poor because medical advancements are massively more aligned with people who have more time on Earth and more wealth to accrue far more wealth in the first place. Those job advancement opportunities that she speaks of, the fact that the poor and the young are constantly blocked out by old people who not only think in ways that are not catching up with societal progress, but also far more likely to be inwardly directed, caring far more about their own legacies and their own reputations and sustaining people in their own immediate vicinities, as opposed to just thinking about either enjoying themselves individually without the ability to, I guess, accrue wealth and block out other people. That is incredibly important on our side of the house. We're very, very proud to propose.
I think the speaker for that speech is about the opposition to conclude this debate.
I have two main questions in this speech. First, are we better off dealing with this fear of the unknown? And secondly, are there better, meaningful experiences once you're past 50 worth living for that basically make sure that it would be worth it to live past 50? And we're going to deal with their point on this idea of how expectations can deal with everything. Managing expectations can deal with everything in that issue. Before that, 3 points that don't really stick. First, on this idea of selfishness. Look, I don't think it was ever a claim to say that every person who is older is automatically more altruistic. What we're saying is obviously people could be selfish on either side. So we think it's a wash. Secondly, the other thing that's washing this debate is the idea that in terms of productivity, they're accusing us of basically like having a world where only people can be conservative or something like that. But the point of Nacho's extension was to say that we need to create a balance wherein we have old people who exist who can participate in that discourse to ensure that we have different ideas in our society that will influence the kinds of ways we would want to live in. Particularly important here is the idea, for example, of why family systems, support systems, which are more conservative, could be important, which happens to be the main reason why all the problems they talk about exist in some societies, but don't exist as pertinently in other societies, which is why we think that balance is important to have. Thirdly, we think it's also washy when they say that in terms of the quantity of people working and there will be more productivity is just weird. Because I think that Nacho's point is important in the sense that there are jobs which I mean, there's not like maximum employment right now, right? But we need to get that maximum employment if we are closer to getting that maximum employment if you don't cut off everyone who's 50 and force them to just die, because there are people taking those kinds of jobs. Hence, we think their response doesn't really take away notch extension. Let's get to the first issue. We would agree, yes, as time passes, when you're maybe like 60 and 70, there are some people who would like still have that fear of the unknown. But what our point is that people who are past 50 are usually better equipped in dealing with that fear of the unknown. Look, on either side of the house, there is still anxiety. There will be people who are below 50 who still have that fear. The unique nuance is when you are a person who is 35 years old, who spent their entire lives doing everything they described from hedonistic lifestyles, drinking every day or whatnot, you miss out on things which create things like generativity, giving back to your community, as seeing people grow up, or you already established a certain legacy that you had, which makes you more able to move on and look forward to your death later. These are things which are people who are above 50, which is why we think more people are comparatively able to deal with that sort of anxiety. But more than that, we think that it's odd for them to say that once you're like above 60 and you're like this person who's above 60, there's usually tends to be more loneliness. This is OG's point. I think that this probably applies maybe to people who are already like maybe terminally ill or something like that. But not everyone past 50, in the majority of cases, is someone who is like alone, who has no friends, who has no families, and is just as miserable as they describe. We think that they're exaggerating the kinds of like, outcomes of why it's so bad to go past 50. Which is why at this point, we think that if you weigh the amount of people who will be happy in this debate, many people who live past 50, who are actually still happy towards when they reach 70 or maybe would be happy past that, are going to die. And they will miss out on those kinds of important experiences we find essential to a human life. So we think fundamentally that's just wrong. But then we also think, second of all, another stakeholder in this debate, which nobody seems to like care about, are the people who will not have parents by the time they're maybe 20 or something like that. They're essentially creating a world where a lot of people will feel miserable, will feel depressed. And we think that this is an important point, because the misery that you feel when maybe you're 70 or 80 or something like that isn't something uniquely bad. I'm pretty sure so many kids on their version of the world will feel very depressed. And I'm sure many of us will feel that it's not a nice thing if looking back, we let's say how their parents died at a much earlier age, right? I think if you look at the net, there will be so many reasons why there are outcomes which cannot just be imagined away by just removing those kinds of expectations. If you tell a lot of people who go through these kinds of suffering, I don't think that it would have helped them if you simply said that you're suffering now because you didn't manage your expectations enough. We think these are inherently bad that don't just go away when you imagine the expectation away. I'm gonna get more onto that in the second issue, but before that, sure.
Because old people feel compelled, either for necessity or through social norms, to keep working until they're 65. This is an era with the largest rate of youth unemployment in history. Why is it a good thing?
Okay,
to lock up the top tiers?
I will weigh this. First thing to weigh here is, sure, there might be people who are increasingly, like being unemployed when they're old, right? But the first thing you have to weigh this up is this, that in the developing world, where in the majority of cases, the culture doesn't look like that. And if it is about the maximizing greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people, I think that a lot of many people, old people in the developing world don't suffer that kind of misery. Most of these people have strong family cultures. They have jobs, for example, in teaching in universities, talking in churches, giving back to their community, among other things. In these places where in these cultures, look like this, I don't think they suffer that kind of misery in the majority of cases. But second of all, that's unresponsive to our extension, which is that increasingly though, as the world progresses, it's not going to look like that. When things, for example, become more automated everywhere, we think that what's probably likely to happen is it's going to be extremely cheap to live, even if you're old. So maybe you might not, worst case scenario, get that job you talked about, but we think a lot of these older people can experience certain leisures and certain luxuries that they can experience much easier later on in life. And these can still give meaning and fulfillment to them, which is why we think they're not really going to be as miserable as they say. But now let's weigh this up though with what they can't mitigate. Firstly, a lot of people are actually going to suffer a comparable harm to that anxiety and siege extension. Think of, for example, many people who just devote all their time from when they're 20 to 40 on hedonistic kinds of experiences. But the difference will be that they will not enjoy those experiences with the perception of like when you're like 50 and you were looking forward to that retirement from years ago. We think the level of happiness you would achieve when you actually had that expectation of enjoy them once you're retired is a very good thing, because and they're also much freer to actually do them without the pressures of going back to work the next day or something like that, right? You're also able to enjoy them with more people, like your family, once you're past 50, among other things. So we think fundamentally, there's a good thing when some people actually have these kinds of expectations that we still keep under our side. But second of all, we think they also have to weigh this up with all the people who will not grow up with parents, who will feel misery and feel depressed and not be able to integrate as well later on in their lives, right? I think these are real concrete harms that they have ignored, which are very real and cause massive depression and anxiety, which they're worried about to let a lot more people. For these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Next speaker or speakers. Sorry, you don't have to. I'm going to be a while. So.